What would you do if you woke up in the middle of the night and realized a stranger was already inside your home? The summer night in Los Angeles was thick, almost suffocating. Streetlights cast long, pale shadows across the sidewalks, flickering occasionally like hesitant witnesses. The faint rustle of leaves in the warm breeze was the only sound that dared disturb the silence. Houses stood quietly, windows shut tightly, doors locked. Yet, somewhere in the darkened alleys, a figure moved with absolute confidence. Silent, purposeful, almost unreal. A tall, thin man with eyes that glimmered with something not human, something predatory. Every sound in the neighborhood seemed magnified. A dog barking, a car door slamming, the distant siren of an ambulance. Yet inside the homes, families slept unaware. The darkness was alive, stretching into corners where light never touched, carrying a sense of anticipation, of something terrible about to unfold. And in that silence, the shadow moved closer. Each step measured, calculated. The city slept, oblivious. But one man, the predator, prowled through the night with only one thought: control. Fear would be his instrument, and tonight, the city would play his melody. Richard Ramirez was born in 1960 in Texas, in a house where fear was a constant companion. From the very first cries as a newborn, the walls echoed with tension. His father, Miguel, a violent man, often lashed out at anyone in sight. Screams filled the house, sometimes muffled, sometimes sharp enough to pierce the night. Young Richard watched it all, wide-eyed, silent, absorbing every detail. The air inside the home was heavy, always thick with anger or threat. Shadows seemed to linger in corners, waiting. Each object in the house became a silent witness. The broken chair from a tantrum, the splintered door from a blow, the bloodstains no one ever cleaned. Even the mundane moments were tinged with terror. A raised hand, a slammed plate, a voice raised in anger. To Richard, these became lessons, twisted guides to understanding power and fear. He learned to hide, to anticipate, to measure each movement in the house with meticulous care. Every shadow could hide violence. Every creak could mean danger. School offered no relief. Classrooms were alien spaces, filled with children who didn't understand him. Teachers were distant, uninterested. The streets offered no comfort either. They were just as chaotic, just as unforgiving. And so, the home, the violence, the fear, all became the forge that shaped his mind. Each scream, each strike, each glance of malice was absorbed, internalized, remembered. School offered no refuge. The streets offered no comfort. But in the shadows, his mind sharpened, planning, observing, and learning the art of fear. Richard wandered through life like a ghost. He was there, but no one truly saw him. Classmates whispered, ignored, or laughed at him. Teachers labeled him difficult, unmotivated. But while others were distracted by trivialities, he was noticing, observing, calculating. He watched the faces of people, their reactions, their fears, their weaknesses. How a sudden noise could make them jump. How a glance in the dark could freeze their movements. Every encounter became a lesson, a blueprint for future manipulation. The streets outside were equally revealing. Alleys, empty lots, abandoned houses, each became a classroom of human behavior. He saw arguments that ended in blows, moments of vulnerability and drunken stumbles, the subtle panic in someone who realized they were being watched. Fear was everywhere, and he was learning to harness it. By day, he appeared small, ordinary, almost invisible. By night, his mind replayed every observation, every reaction he'd seen, He traced patterns, tested ideas in his imagination, and practiced the control that would one day terrify an entire city. The shadows became his mentor, the darkness his confidant, and the world a stage on which he would rehearse the ultimate performance. The house was small, fragile, and filled with an unease that never truly left. Every evening seemed to echo with tension, voices raised, footsteps pacing, doors slamming. For young Richard, it was as if the walls themselves carried the weight of anger, storing it, waiting for it to erupt. And then, one night, it did. The shouting reached a pitch higher than ever before. Words turned sharp, cutting through the air like knives. Suddenly, a sound thundered through the room, not like ordinary noise, but like the world itself cracking open inside those walls. The air shook, the lamp trembled, and in that instant, silence fell heavier than any scream could ever be. A chair tipped over. Something heavy hit the floor. The faint glow of the ceiling bulb flickered wildly, shadows stretching long and distorted across the peeling wallpaper. The room was no longer just a home. It had transformed into something else. A chamber of dread, a place where innocence was shattered forever. And there he was, Richard, just a child, standing still. No tears, no cry for help, no attempt to run. His wide, dark eyes locked onto the scene, unblinking. He was not just witnessing the horror. He was absorbing it, piece by piece, letting it carve itself into his mind. For him, this moment was not a nightmare to be forgotten. It was a lesson in power, in dominance, in fear. The silence that followed was louder than the chaos before it. The only sound left was the faint buzzing of the light bulb above, humming like a cruel reminder of what had just taken place. To Richard, that hum became part of the memory, the soundtrack of his awakening. A seed had been planted, and in the dark corners of his young mind, it began to grow. After that night, the world no longer looked the same to Richard. The house, once only filled with noise and anger, now felt hollow, a shell where echoes of chaos lingered. He walked through the rooms in silence, his small footsteps muffled by an atmosphere that seemed heavier with every passing day. No one asked what he saw. No one asked what he felt. And so, he carried it alone. School was no escape. The classrooms were filled with other children, but to Richard, they were strangers. Their laughter felt distant, their games meaningless. While others scribbled homework or shared secrets at recess, Richard's eyes were always elsewhere, staring out the window, lost in a world no one else could see. The teachers noticed his silence, his lack of connection, but few bothered to reach beyond the surface. And so he drifted further, step by step, into his own private shadows. The streets of El Paso offered no comfort either. They were hot, harsh, and unforgiving. Richard wandered them like a ghost, watching people live lives he could not touch. The heat pressed down like a weight, but inside his mind, a storm was forming. With every lonely walk, with every ignored question, with every unspoken thought, something was building. Sharper, darker, more dangerous. And in those shadows, Richard began to learn. He watched the way people carried themselves, the way fear flickered in their eyes when startled, the way control could shift with a single gesture or a single word. To him, these were not passing observations. They were lessons. Lessons about power, about dominance, about the invisible strings that guided human behavior. By night, when the house finally fell quiet, Richard would lie awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts spun endlessly, weaving patterns of control, rehearsing scenarios, imagining futures where he was no longer the silent child, but the one who dictated the silence of others. In that fragile age, his mind was sharpening, not toward innocence, not toward dreams, but toward the art of fear. Isolation had not broken him, it had molded him. Every unanswered question, every overlooked pain, every lonely night became the chisels that shaped the boy into something far more menacing. Richard was not just surviving his world, he was being transformed by it. As Richard grew, silence became his closest companion. But silence was never truly empty. In the stillness of his room, with the blinds drawn and the air thick with the smell of dust and sweat, he began to feel something else. A pull, a whisper in the dark, subtle at first, like a voice that wasn't there, like a shadow that moved when nothing else did. It was as if the very darkness itself was speaking to him. He found escape in books and magazines, but not the kind other children read. Where others flipped through colorful pages of cartoons or adventure stories, Richard's hands lingered on images of violence, of forbidden rituals, of strange symbols and practices hidden from the everyday world. Each picture seemed to call out to him, promising secrets, promising power. The grotesque didn't repel him, it fascinated him. It was as though his mind, already sharpened by years of pain and neglect, now found nourishment in the macabre. At night, when the moon carved pale shapes across his bedroom walls, Richard would imagine worlds far darker than the one outside. He pictured himself not as a boy, but as a force, unseen, unstoppable. He fantasized about control, about fear, about bending others to his will. And with every thought, the boundary between imagination and desire blurred a little more. The streets gave him new material. Stray animals, broken bottles, shattered glass in alleyways, all became symbols in his growing inner theater of cruelty. He lingered in graveyards, fascinated not by mourning, but by the silence that wrapped around the tombstones. Where others saw grief, he saw beauty in decay. The scent of wilted flowers, the flicker of a dying candle, all of it fed into a growing hunger that he could not name. Dark music, horror stories, whispered tales of the occult. These became the soundtrack of his adolescence. He absorbed them like scripture, his young mind piecing together fragments of shadows into something whole, something alive inside him. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was devotion, a devotion to the unknown, to the terrifying, to the power that comes not from kindness or love, but from fear. And in that devotion, Richard found purpose. The isolation of his past had prepared him. The neglect had hardened him. Now, with each dark whisper, each shadowy image, he was being guided. Step by step, his fascination grew into obsession. An obsession that would soon demand more than imagination. It would demand action. The whispers had been with Richard for years now, guiding him, shaping him. But whispers alone were no longer enough. They demanded more. They demanded proof, proof that he was listening, proof that he belonged to the shadows he worshipped in silence. So, he began small. In the quiet alleys of El Paso, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets emptied, Richard would roam. Stray animals, fragile, voiceless, unseen by most, became the first canvas for his experiments. He didn't see them as living creatures. To him, they were vessels, tests, stepping stones in a ritual only he understood. The darkness inside him smiled as he watched life flicker and fade under his hands. And Richard, just a boy, felt a rush he couldn't explain, a twisted blend of fear, power, and satisfaction. But it wasn't just the acts themselves, it was the setting. He chose places where silence could swallow sound, under bridges, near abandoned houses, in the dusty corners of forgotten lots. The stillness became part of the ritual, as if the world itself conspired to cloak his deeds in secrecy. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every flicker of a distant streetlight felt like acknowledgement, a private audience to his growing obsession. At home, his fascination deepened. He clipped images from magazines, grotesque pictures, dark symbols, photographs of rituals he barely understood. He pinned them inside notebooks, creating his own private scripture of horror. He practiced drawing pentagrams, studied books on the occult he borrowed in secret, and listened to music that seemed to echo the violence building inside him. To others, he was quiet, withdrawn, almost invisible. But in his mind, Richard was building a kingdom of shadows, one where he reigned supreme. What terrified others only excited him. Blood didn't disgust him, it mesmerized him. Symbols of death, skulls, knives, fire, weren't warnings, but invitations. He began to fantasize, in detail, about extending his experiments to people. The neighbors he passed on the street, the strangers who didn't notice him. Each face became part of a silent theater in his imagination, where fear was the script and he was the director. The whispers grew louder. They told him he was chosen, that the ordinary rules, family, morality, law, were not made for him. He was different, special, destined to carve his name into the fabric of fear itself. And Richard believed them. Every time his heart raced with that intoxicating mix of danger and control, he felt closer to becoming what the whispers promised, a predator in a world of prey. By the time he reached adolescence, Richard was no longer just a boy scarred by violence. He was a vessel being filled, drop by drop, with something far darker, something that would not stay contained forever. His experiments were only the beginning. The hunger inside him was growing, and soon it would demand far more than shadows and silence. Richard was no longer satisfied with shadows and whispers. The experiments in silence had given him a taste, but his hunger demanded more. The streets of El Paso became his hunting ground, not for survival, but for thrill. And with each step into the night, he edged closer to a line that could never be uncrossed. It started with theft. At first, small things: a wallet left unattended, coins from a store counter, a trinket from a neighbor's yard. But for Richard, it wasn't about the value. It was about the act, the rush, the knowledge that he could take what wasn't his, and no one could stop him. Each stolen object became a secret trophy, proof that the rules of ordinary life no longer applied to him. But Richard's ambitions grew quickly. Petty theft was too easy, too shallow. He craved intrusion, the violation of spaces that weren't meant for him. Late at night, he began slipping into homes, moving silently like a shadow through unlocked windows and doors. He didn't always take things. Sometimes he simply wandered the rooms, breathing in the air of lives he did not belong to, standing inches away from sleeping strangers. The thrill wasn't in possession, it was in power. The power of knowing he was inside their sanctuary, their most sacred place, and they had no idea. Imagine it. A young boy, barely a teenager, standing over the bed of a family he didn't know, watching, listening, his heart pounding, not with fear of being caught, but with excitement. He was invisible, untouchable, a phantom in the night. And as he crept back out into the darkness, he carried with him something far more intoxicating than stolen objects: the memory of control, the feeling that lives could be invaded, and he alone held the key. By day, Richard blended into the background. He was quiet, unremarkable, almost forgettable. But at night, his double life grew bolder. He studied how locks worked, how shadows fell across windows, how footsteps carried through empty streets. The city became his classroom, and crime became his curriculum. Every burglary was a test, every risk another step toward the predator he was becoming. Soon, even burglary wasn't enough. He began to fantasize about encounters, about waking someone up and watching the fear take hold in their eyes. To Richard, fear was a currency more valuable than gold. Fear was control. Fear was power. And the more he tasted it, the more he hungered for it. Neighbors whispered about strange break-ins, missing objects, and an eerie sense of being watched. But no one suspected the quiet, lanky boy lurking in the background. Richard was invisible by design. He moved through life like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to predict. And inside his mind, the whispers praised him. He was preparing, sharpening, becoming exactly what they promised, a creature born to spread terror. By the end of his teenage years, Richard Ramirez was no longer just a troubled boy scarred by violence. He was a shadow that walked among the living, rehearsing for horrors far greater than anyone could imagine. His footsteps had crossed the line, and now, there was no turning back. For years, Richard had been content with shadows, with silent trespasses and stolen objects. But hunger grows. Shadows weren't enough anymore. He craved sound. He craved struggle. He craved the fear of the living, not just the silence of the sleeping. One summer night, under the heavy heat of El Paso, Richard followed a man leaving a bar. The man was drunk, stumbling through the empty street, unaware of the figure trailing behind him. Richard's heart raced, not from fear of being caught, but from anticipation. This was no longer about theft. This was about domination. He waited until the man turned into a dark alley. Then, like a predator, Richard struck. He lunged forward, knocking the man to the ground. The smell of alcohol mixed with sweat and blood as the stranger cried out in shock. But Richard didn't stop. He kicked, punched, his fists fueled by years of rage at his father, his family, his life. Every strike wasn't against the man. It was against the ghosts that haunted him. The alley echoed with grunts and the dull thud of fists on flesh. Richard's breathing grew heavier, not from exhaustion, but from exhilaration. For the first time, he wasn't just stealing objects. He was stealing safety. He was showing another human being that they were powerless, that their body, their life, could be broken at his will. When it was over, the man lay crumpled on the ground, blood dripping from his mouth, moaning in pain. Richard didn't kill him. He didn't need to. The violence itself was enough. He stood over the broken man, staring down with cold eyes, his lips curled into something between a grin and a sneer. And in that moment, Richard felt it. The rush, the electricity in his veins, the fire that whispered, "This is who you are." He walked away, disappearing back into the shadows, leaving the man groaning in the dirt. No one saw him. No one knew his name. But Richard carried the memory like a sacred treasure. The blood on his hands wasn't a stain. It was a baptism, a first taste. And like every hunger, once tasted, it would only grow. After that night, Richard wasn't the same. He became bolder, crueler. He no longer looked at people as neighbors, strangers, or passers-by. He looked at them as prey. Every face on the street was a potential victim. Every locked door was a challenge waiting to be conquered. And every night, the thought of violence tugged at him like an irresistible call. His crimes escalated. Breaking into homes became more reckless. Sometimes he stole, sometimes he vandalized, but often He just left a trail of fear, letting families wake to discover that someone had been there, moving through their rooms while they slept. Richard didn't always need to hurt people physically. Sometimes the fear itself was enough. Fear, he had learned, was the most powerful weapon of all. But deep down, he knew the truth. The night in the alley had awakened something in him, something savage, something insatiable. Richard Ramirez had crossed another line, from thief to predator to violent hunter. And once again, there was no going back. The summer of 1984. Los Angeles was alive with music, neon lights, and endless nightlife. But beneath the bright glamour of the city, darkness was stirring. Richard Ramirez had been roaming the streets for weeks, hungry for something greater, something permanent. Petty theft no longer thrilled him. Beatings weren't enough. The whisper inside his head demanded more, demanded blood. That night, the city felt strangely quiet. The air was heavy, pressing down like a blanket of heat. Richard's boots echoed softly against the sidewalk as he scanned the houses of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Each one looked peaceful, each one filled with sleeping families who believed they were safe. But safety was an illusion, one he was about to shatter forever. He spotted a small house at the end of the block, its lights long since turned off. The windows were shut but not locked, a careless mistake, and a deadly one. Richard slipped inside like a shadow, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from anticipation. He moved silently through the living room, past family photos on the wall, until he found the bedroom. Inside, a woman slept alone. Her breathing was steady, her chest rising and falling beneath the thin summer blanket. Richard stood over her for a long moment, simply watching, the thrill already coursing through his veins. Then, he moved. The struggle was short, brutal, and merciless. The woman's scream tore through the night, but the walls swallowed it. No one came. No one heard. The sound of violence filled the room, sharp, chaotic, final. And then, silence. When it was over, Richard stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, staring down at what he had done. Blood stained his hands, his clothes, the sheets. For a moment, he felt a wave of something unfamiliar. Not guilt, not pity, but power. Complete and intoxicating power. He wasn't just a thief anymore. He wasn't just a predator. He was death itself, moving freely through the streets of Los Angeles. He wiped his hands on the bedsheets and walked out into the night, disappearing into the darkness as if nothing had happened. Behind him, the house was silent once again. The city continued to dream, unaware that its nightmare had just begun. This was the moment Richard Ramirez truly became the Night Stalker. And from here on out, there was no turning back. The summer of 1984. Los Angeles was alive with music, neon lights, and endless nightlife. But beneath the bright glamour of the city, darkness was stirring. Richard Ramirez had been roaming the streets for weeks, hungry for something greater, something permanent. Petty theft no longer thrilled him. Beatings weren't enough. The whisper inside his head demanded more, demanded blood. That night, the city felt strangely quiet. The air was heavy, pressing down like a blanket of heat. Richard's boots echoed softly against the sidewalk as he scanned the houses of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Each one looked peaceful, each one filled with sleeping families who believed they were safe. But safety was an illusion, one he was about to shatter forever. He spotted a small house at the end of the block, its lights long since turned off. The windows were shut but not locked, a careless mistake, and a deadly one. Richard slipped inside like a shadow, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from anticipation. He moved silently through the living room, past family photos on the wall, until he found the bedroom. Inside, a woman slept alone. Her breathing was steady, her chest rising and falling beneath the thin summer blanket. Richard stood over her for a long moment, simply watching, the thrill already coursing through his veins. Then, he moved. The struggle was short, brutal, and merciless. The woman's scream tore through the night, but the walls swallowed it. No one came. No one heard. The sound of violence filled the room, sharp, chaotic, final. And then, silence. When it was over, Richard stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, staring down at what he had done. Blood stained his hands, his clothes, the sheets. For a moment, he felt a wave of something unfamiliar. Not guilt, not pity, but power. Complete and intoxicating power. He wasn't just a thief anymore. He wasn't just a predator. He was death itself, moving freely through the streets of Los Angeles. He wiped his hands on the bedsheets and walked out into the night, disappearing into the darkness as if nothing had happened. Behind him, the house was silent once again. The city continued to dream, unaware that its nightmare had just begun. This was the moment Richard Ramirez truly became the Night Stalker. And from here on out, there was no turning back. It was only weeks after the first murder. Los Angeles had just begun to catch its breath, convincing itself that the horror was random, a one-time tragedy. But in the dead of night, Richard was already hunting again. The house was small, tucked at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The windows glowed faintly with the blue light of a late-night television show. Inside, a family slept soundly, unaware that danger was already at their doorstep. Richard moved like a shadow. No sound, no hesitation. He slipped inside, the creak of the floorboards the only betrayal of his presence. His eyes scanned the room, hungry, restless, alive with a kind of twisted excitement. He wasn't looking for money. He wasn't looking for valuables. He was looking for fear. What happened next was chaos. A sudden crash, muffled screams, the sharp sound of violence erupting in the darkness. A lamp shattered, spraying glass across the carpet. Footsteps pounded the floor as panic consumed the small house. The walls seemed to trap the terror inside, every scream bouncing back louder than the last. And then, silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. When the sun rose the next morning, neighbors would speak of strange noises in the night, of shadows moving past windows. Police would once again arrive to a scene marked by brutality and cruelty. Another life taken, another home shattered. The city could no longer tell itself that this was random. Something, someone, was out there. And for Richard, the thrill was even greater this time. He had discovered a terrifying truth. The more the city feared him, the more powerful he felt. Fear wasn't just a byproduct of his crimes. It was his fuel. He fed on it, craved it, needed it. And now, Los Angeles was becoming his hunting ground. By the time the second crime scene was discovered, Los Angeles was already whispering. 2 homes, 2 families destroyed, both in the dead of night. Both struck with a violence that seemed inhuman. The newspapers ran bold headlines: "Killer at large," "Nighttime terror," "The devil in the dark." Radio talk shows buzzed with theories. Was it a gang, a drifter, or something far more sinister? Police tried to calm the public, insisting that everything was under control. But behind closed doors, detectives were terrified. The randomness of the attacks made them nearly impossible to predict. There was no clear motive, no pattern they could hold on to, only fear, and the chilling certainty that he would strike again. In quiet neighborhoods, people started double-locking their doors. Windows were nailed shut. Families slept with lights on, dogs were brought inside, and fathers stayed awake through the night, with baseball bats clutched tightly in their hands. And in the shadows, Richard listened. He watched, he read the headlines, and he smiled. The city was speaking his name, even if they didn't know it yet. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was becoming a legend of fear, a phantom that haunted every dream and every dark corner. The nickname would soon come. The Night Stalker, a name that would crawl under the skin of every Angelino and turn the darkness of night into the most terrifying place on Earth. It didn't take long before the media found its hook. One chilling headline in bold black letters read, "The Night Stalker strikes again." And just like that, the legend was born. A faceless phantom that crept through windows, leaving only blood, fear, and silence behind. Los Angeles had a name for its terror, and Richard Ramirez embraced it like a crown. But while the name gave him power, it also made him reckless. With every crime, he grew bolder, leaving behind small but crucial threads of evidence. At one crime scene, detectives found a shoe print in the garden soil, a rare Avia sneaker, size 11.5. Hard to find, even in a city the size of Los Angeles. That print became a silent witness, marking his path from house to house. In another attack, he left fingerprints smeared across a window pane, half hidden in the dust. At the time, the technology to quickly match them was limited, but the evidence was there, waiting. Witnesses also began to describe the same chilling figure, a tall, gaunt man with rotten teeth and eyes that seemed to glow with malice. One survivor recalled the smell of him, sweat, decay, and something almost animalistic. And yet, Richard didn't stop. If anything, the fame fueled him. He read the newspapers obsessively, clipping out every article that mentioned the Night Stalker. Each headline was like fuel to his twisted ego. He wasn't just killing anymore. He was performing for an audience of millions, all watching, all terrified. But every performance leaves traces. Every curtain call leaves a clue. And though Richard didn't know it yet, those mistakes, the sneaker print, the fingerprints, the surviving witnesses, were threads that would one day tighten around his neck. By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles was no longer the city of angels. It was a fortress of fear. Hardware stores reported record sales of locks, deadbolts, and security bars. Gun shops sold out of ammunition. Families who never thought twice about leaving a window open in the warm California night now nailed them shut with wooden planks. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other before now formed nightly patrols. Some streets became barricaded communities, people standing guard with flashlights and baseball bats, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. The fear wasn't just in the poor neighborhoods or the wealthy suburbs. It was everywhere. From East LA to San Francisco, no one felt safe. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Don't sleep near the window. Don't answer the door at night. Even the sound of a creaking floorboard or a barking dog was enough to send shivers down an entire household. And in the middle of this storm of paranoia, Richard Ramirez thrived. He knew the city was trembling, and that gave him power. He didn't just break into homes. He broke into the collective psyche of millions of people. He was no longer just a killer. He was the embodiment of fear itself. But with fear came pressure. Detectives were working around the clock, connecting the dots. The Avia shoe print, the fingerprint smudges, the survivors' testimonies. The puzzle pieces were slowly coming together. And Richard, drunk on his growing infamy, was about to make more mistakes. By late summer, the LAPD and Sheriff's Department had something they didn't have before: a trail. Detectives laid the crime scene photos side by side. Different homes, different neighborhoods, different victims. But slowly, the chaos began to take shape. A pattern emerged, not in who he chose, but in how he struck. Always at night, always slipping through open windows or doors, always leaving behind a signature of terror. And then came the first real breakthrough. The Avia shoe print. Rare, size 11.5. Only a few pairs existed in the Los Angeles area, and every single one except his was accounted for. That single print became the ghostly fingerprint of the Night Stalker. Survivors, still trembling from their encounters, began giving descriptions. Tall, gaunt, dark hair, wide staring eyes, eyes that didn't look human. The sketch artist's pencil danced across the paper. For the first time, the monster had a face. Fingerprints lifted from a stolen car matched those of a petty criminal already in the system. Richard Ramirez. A name, a face, a record. The phantom was becoming flesh and blood. Police knew they had to move fast. But Ramirez was unpredictable, striking miles apart, never choosing the same type of victim twice. It was like chasing a shadow through a maze. Every night they waited was another life at risk. The media got wind of the manhunt. Newspapers splashed his face across the front page. Television anchors whispered his name with trembling voices. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. For the first time, the predator realized he was being hunted, and in his arrogance, he didn't stop. He grew bolder, careless, and it would be those mistakes that would bring him down. August 1985. The city was boiling under the summer heat, but the tension in Los Angeles was far hotter than the sun. The Night Stalker was no longer an invisible phantom. His face was plastered on every newspaper, every TV screen, every corner store wall. He was being hunted not just by the police, but by the entire city. Yet still, he couldn't stop. Compulsion drove him. Darkness whispered in his ears. He broke into another home, desperate for control, desperate for that same surge of fear he fed upon. But this time, something was different. The shadows no longer protected him. Inside the home, he rushed, frantic, sloppy. He left fingerprints smeared on glass, shoe prints in dust. Witnesses saw him fleeing into the night. Neighbors heard the screams and caught a glimpse of his gaunt figure slipping away under the streetlights. For the first time, the Night Stalker was running, and people were watching. The police gathered evidence with feverish speed. The Avia shoe print again, fingerprints again. But now the witnesses spoke louder, angrier. They weren't whispering about a monster anymore. They were pointing at a man with wide, hungry eyes and decaying teeth. A man whose name was now known by everyone. The net was closing. Ramirez didn't know it yet, but each mistake, each fingerprint, each careless shoe print, each panicked witness was weaving a noose around his neck. The hunter had become the hunted. August 31st, 1985. The city that had trembled for over a year was about to strike back. Ramirez, confident as ever, wandered the streets of East Los Angeles, unaware that fate had finally caught up with him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the alleyways he had once prowled freely. He entered a home, intending another strike, but something felt different. The neighbors were alert. Eyes followed him. Whispers carried down the street. Panic surged, but this time, not his own. Outside, a group of residents noticed a strange figure stumbling out of a home, sweating, desperate, and clearly not acting like a normal man. The children's father, a quick-thinking local, raised the alarm. Men chased him down the street, wielding whatever they could grab, pipes, sticks, anything to stop him. Ramirez tried to escape, but the crowd was relentless. They surrounded him, shouting, striking, immobilizing him. For the first time in years, the Night Stalker felt fear. Not excitement, not control, real fear. He struggled, fought, and screamed, but the people of East LA refused to let him slip away. Minutes later, police arrived to a scene of chaos. Richard Ramirez, the terror of Los Angeles, was finally in handcuffs. His reign of terror, built on shadows and fear, was over. Every footprint, every fingerprint, every careless mistake had finally led to his capture. The city exhaled, though uneasily. For months, Los Angeles had been holding its breath, and now, finally, the nightmare had a name, a face, and a cell. But even behind bars, the legend lived on. The Night Stalker had left a mark not just on homes and families, but on the psyche of a city, a shadow that would never fully disappear.